Okay, let's get started. This is Sefer Yetzirah Introduction Part 2. And recall in Part 1 we talked mainly about this passage, Ecclesiastes 7:14, where it says that God has made one thing opposite another. Okay, and we talked about how that is the foundation of all of Jewish mysticism. Everything starts out in a state of oneness with God, and then the creation involves separation of one thing from another. Separate land from water, this from that. Okay. And the whole point of this creation, of all this separation, we have A opposite not A, but also some kind of interaction, communication between them. But the whole point of this is to eventually understand the truth about reality and to bring everything back together into the state of unity and oneness. All right. In part 2 of our introduction, I want to introduce you to some different names for God in ancient biblical Hebrew. So let's go on to the next slide. In English, we usually just say God, and that's it. In Hebrew, there are lots of different names for God, and the few I have listed on this slide, they don't exhaust everything that's out there, but these are good ones to know about. So, let's start with the first one, which is Yah. This name occurs a couple of times in Exodus, more in Isaiah, and then several times in Psalms. Okay? In Hebrew, it's spelled Yud-Hey, and if you don't know it already, in ancient biblical Hebrew, every letter in the alphabet is also a number. The alphabet doubled as the number system. Okay, so if we want to know the numerical value of Yah, well, Yud plus Hey, that's going to be 10 plus 5, which is 15. Now, the way we use this is if you come across any other word which has a numerical value of 15, then there might be a relation between that word and this particular name of God. And to tell the truth, thinking that there might be a connection, well, that stimulates the imagination. And in exploring ways in which this other word might be related to Yah, that often causes some growth. We may find connections that were not intended, but nonetheless they may enrich us. Okay. Now, it's believed by many that Yah is just an abbreviated, a shortened form of Yahweh, which is the next name. Now, Yahweh, which is spelled Yud-Hey-Vav-Hey in Hebrew, this is the most sacred name for God in Hebrew and Judaism. And this is the name that is usually not pronounced. Okay. It's sometimes just called the name. It's also known as the Tetragrammaton, and that is just Greek for a four-letter name. Okay. Now, linguists believe that this particular name is a reflexive form of the verb to be, and thus you could interpret this name as meaning the one who causes being, or in other words, the creator. Okay, now the numerical value of Yud-Hey-Vav-Hey is 10 plus 5 plus 6 plus 5, which comes out to 26. And thus, if we find something which adds up to 26, then we think there might be a connection with this particular name of God. Now, a very well-known example is if you take the Hebrew word for love, ahava, that has a numerical value of 13. And then if you take the Hebrew word for one, echad, that also has a numerical value of 13. And hence, just as 26 is equal to 13 plus 13, we say in mystical Judaism that God is equal to love plus oneness. By the way, all this number play that we do with Hebrew words, we call that gematria. And the term gematria, it actually comes from Greek. It basically from a Greek word meaning to measure. And in fact, the word geometry and the word gematria, they come from the same Greek root. But nonetheless, when we're talking about Jewish numerology, we use this Greek word, gematria, to describe it. Okay, now, another thing that you should probably be aware of at this point, or I think you should be aware of it, is it's something from mathematics. In mathematics, we often talk about collections, usually collections of numbers, and those collections we call sets. Now, what most people in the general public probably aren't aware of is that when these sets or collections get too large, they can become paradoxical and contradictory. And that in particular happens when we look at what we might call the set of all sets. It leads to all sorts of paradoxes and contradictions, and consequently in mathematics we usually take that right off the table because we don't like contradictions. So we don't call the set of all sets a set. We say it must be something else, and the usual rules of set theory don't apply to it, so we don't have to worry about all those contradictions. Well, to me, the bottom line is this. The set of all sets, that would be sort of our mathematical way of trying to describe everything, the collection of all things. And that might also be how we might describe God. Because certainly we would think everything must be contained within God. And then you have God, himself, herself, itself. Okay? So let's say that God is also what we might call the collection of everything. Well, we know from mathematics that that concept is paradoxical and contradictory. And in mystical Judaism, we often see God as paradoxical and contradictory. God is indescribable. And nothing epitomizes the ineffableness of God, our inability to describe God better than this one name, Yutevave, which traditionally we never pronounce. Now, this concept that I'm talking about, you also find it in rabbinic literature. Let me go for a moment to the next slide. This is from Genesis Rabbah, the great rabbinical commentary on Genesis that was done by the same rabbis that you find in the Talmud. And so this is almost a couple of thousand years old. But anyway, Rav Huna said, "Whatever things you see are but parts of the ways of the Holy One, blessed be He. As it says, Lo, these are but parts of His ways," quoting Job 26:14. So consequently, in rabbinic Judaism, and particularly in mystical Judaism and Kabbalah, it's understood that God is ultimately incapable of being described. All we can describe, all that we can see directly, are just some of the component parts. But when all goes together as a whole, it becomes unknowable. Okay, now let's go back to our slide with the names of God. Aside from Yud-He-Vav-He, oh, by the way, I should mention that in translations from Hebrew into English, since we don't pronounce Yud-He-Vav-He directly, in Hebrew people often just say Adonai or Adonai, which means Lord, and then in English, we see this four-letter name just translated as Lord. But the better translation is Creator. Okay, now the second most often encountered name for God in Judaism and the Bible is Elohim. Names like El, Elohai, Elohim, these came from the peoples that were surrounding the Israelites as Judaism came into being. Okay, and actually it's a plural word. So if there's a neighboring culture that worship many gods, then Elohim, being plural, would refer to all of those gods. In Judaism, it's still written and pronounced as a plural word, but it's understood we're talking about just one God. And you can see that the gematria or numerical value of Elohim is 1 plus 30 plus 5 plus 10 plus 40, which adds up to 86. That is also the numerical value or gematria of Hateva, which means nature or the nature. And consequently, Elohim is seen as having a more direct connection with the creation and the world of objects that we see surrounding us. Now, in rabbinic literature, the rabbis like to say that when God is exhibiting his mercy, he uses the name Yutevave. But when he's executing justice, he uses the name Elohim. In Kabbalah, in Jewish mysticism, however, a different distinction is made. Quite often, Yud-He-Vav-He is used to represent the unknowable God, the God we can't even conceive of, the God that cannot be perceived directly. Elohim, in contrast, is the God that we give characteristics to, like merciful and just and long-suffering, things like that. So Elohim is a God that is at least partially disclosed, while Yud-He-Vav-He, not always, because there are these differences of opinion and contradictions in Jewish mysticism, but quite often in the Zohar, that 13th century classic of Jewish mysticism, Yud-He-Vav-He is used to represent the undisclosed God, the one that can't be perceived. Okay, moving on to the next name, we have the Shekinah. This name does not occur at all in the Bible, but it's used a lot in rabbinic literature. The root meaning of Shekinah is a word that means to dwell. And Shekinah, for the rabbis, it meant God as an indwelling presence, a God whose presence we can sense or feel. Later, in Jewish mysticism, particularly in the Zohar, Shekinah also came to represent the feminine or female aspect of God. And this is because if you look at the ending of that word, Shekinah, that ah sound, or maybe an English transliteration, that letter H, that usually signifies the plural of a feminine word. And you might notice that that happens also with Yud-He-Vav-He, that letter He, which we usually write as H when we use the English alphabet. That signifies that Yud-He-Vav-He is also a feminine word, which is interesting because we usually refer to this particular name of God as God the Father, a masculine God, but it actually has a feminine ending. Okay. Let's see, and if we look at the numerical value or gematria of Shekinah, that's Shin, Kaf, Yud, Nun, He, that's going to be 300 plus 20 plus 10 plus 50 plus 5, which adds up to 385. Okay, And now the final name for God that I want to introduce you to is one which may not be very familiar to you at all. It's Ehyeh, which translates as I am. It's spelled Aleph He Yud He, and the gematria of that, it's 1 plus 5 plus 10 plus 5, which is going to be 21. Now, if we go back to the Tetragrammaton Yutevave, that's a 4-letter name for God, but 2 of the letters, the letter He is repeated twice. So if we look at just the 3 distinct letters Yud He Vav, and you can look on the slide I'm showing you, if we add up the numerical values of those letters, that's going to be 10 plus 5 plus 6, which is 21. And that is the same as the numerical value of Ehyeh, I am. And that suggests that this name of God, I am, Ehyeh, it's really connected with the most sacred name, Yud He Vav He, because the numerical value of the distinct letters in the Tetragrammaton is 21, exactly the same as the numerical value or gematria of Ehyeh. Okay, now where does this name occur in our Bible? Well, it's in only one place, I believe, in the Torah. One place I know of. I haven't done a thorough search for any other place. But in Exodus 3:14, which I like to call the Pi passage of the Bible, or the Pi passage of the Torah, since Pi is approximately 3.14. Anyway, in Exodus 3:14, it says, "And God said to Moses, I am that I am. And he said, Thus shall you say to the people of Israel, I am has sent me to you." And then in passage 15, it says, "And God said moreover to Moses, Thus shall you say to the people of Israel, Yud He Vav He, the God of your fathers, God of Abraham, the God of Isaac, and the God of Jacob has sent me to you. This is my name forever, and this is my memorial to all generations." Okay, the presence of Yud He Vav He in passage 15, and then it goes on to say, "This is my name forever," that is why the most sacred name for God in Judaism is usually Yud He Vav He, the one we don't pronounce. And that's why the liturgy almost always refers to Yud He Vav He and not to Ehyeh, I am. But let's go back and look at that statement, "I am has sent me to you," and think about what it means. Usually when we say "I am," it's used in connection with some object or modifiers, such as I am a man, I am a woman, I am awake, I am alive, I am happy, I am sad. Whatever word we follow that expression "I am" with, that is something we are identifying with. That is something we're using to describe ourselves. And consequently, our sense of identity, it tends to get attached to things out in the real world, to objects in the real world, and we tend to think that object that we're perceiving or that characteristic we're perceiving is who we actually are. Now, as a spoiler, Kabbalah, Jewish mysticism says, sorry, but that object or that characteristic, that is not who you really are. Who you really are is what you perceive as your pure consciousness, that consciousness without any attachment or identification to an object, okay? And if you don't attach your sense of awareness, your sense of self to an object, then all you're left with when you say I am is the awareness itself, but no connection to any object of perception. Okay, so this is a clue to what God actually is. God is that pure awareness, the thing within us which makes us alive and makes us sentient beings. So, I am, reflect upon that. I am is God, and that is what you are looking for. We'll talk more about this later when we get into the text of the Sefer Yetzirah. But in the meantime, think about this. Think about how your awareness is always going out toward objects, and you're always identifying yourself with some perception. Suppose you do this. Instead of focusing on the object, turn your attention back to the awareness which is perceiving the object. As you do that, as you go back more toward the awareness, you'll immediately start to feel more unity and oneness because there's no division in that awareness, right? There's nothing you see in the awareness. You don't see it directly like an exterior object. And as a result, as you move toward that awareness, you're also moving toward unity and oneness. And as you experience oneness, you also experience love. Because when you love someone or something, you feel no separation between you and them. So love and oneness are actually the same thing. And we can find that by just focusing on the awareness within. Okay, well, we'll stop at this point, and soon we will be getting into the actual text of the Sefer Yetzirah. Okay, so that's it, and we'll talk to you later.